Right. Thank you very much for that introduction, Shai. A lot of difficult words in that, I guess. I'll do my best to pronounce them well as well. So in the preface to the 1965 performance score, John Kirkpatrick wrote of a polyconductoral procedure when describing the performance practice for the second movement of Charles Ives' Fourth Symphony. Kirkpatrick also pointed out that it was not solely Ives' score that ensured this procedure was implemented. It was the publisher, Theodor Sater, who finally persuaded Leopold Stokowski, music director and conductor of the American Symphony Orchestra, of the, quote, necessity of a polyconductoral procedure, end quote, for the symphony's posthumous premiere in 1965. At first glance, that word poly instead of bi-conductoral is intriguing, at least to me, because typical performance practice of the second movement typically sees only 2 or maybe 3 silent conductors standing before the orchestra, a principal and an assistant. However, when the conductor is narrowly defined, paraphrasing Michael Leibowitz's political theory, as one who exercises authority over the individual orchestral musicians, articulating the separate powers of the individual musicians into a collective, and thus winning harmonious cooperation, 6 instances of polyconducting appear in this specific symphonic movement. So in this presentation, I'll first examine those 6 appearances of polyconductoral procedure. I'll then conclude by exploring detectable artistic and socioeconomic motivations for deploying this very method. I'm going to refer to rehearsal numbers in the score quite a bit, so for anyone who would like to follow along more closely, those numbers I've referred to are in the performance score published by Associated Music Publishers in 1965. You can use this QR code to find a copy of that score. However, please keep it to yourself and use it for only research basis because it's still under copyright. I will leave this QR code up for the next couple slides. All right, so the first instance of polyconductoral procedure can be found in the very first measure of the second movement. It starts off with a bang. 4 groups begin in different tempos. All right, the solo piano begins with the first group before breaking away to form the 4th group in their third measure. And yet, all arrive at the same point, the tutti measure 6, having also counted 4 different amounts of played measures. In blue, we see the musicians conducted by the principal conductor. In red and orange, the basses and bassoons, who are under the second conductor's baton, and in green, the solo piano, after having left the principal conductor. All right, now I won't bore you with the mathematics each time, but I just want to show you this the first time exactly how precise Ives was while using such a procedure, and still offering, or perhaps even demanding, musical freedom from the musicians. So above are 2 charts, or here on the screen are 2 charts that I've used to compile each situation. I assigned each group with a number and noted each group's conductor, orchestration, number of measures, and metric information. In the second chart, I have suggested that the 12 seconds of notated material for group 1 could be slightly longer than 12 seconds because Ives has composed a ritardando for this group in the final measure. Likewise, I've suggested that the 12 seconds of material for the solo pianist might be shorter due to Ives marking accelerate freely. It's therefore not really hard to imagine that the pianist will then shave 4 seconds off of these 5 measures, thus also spending somewhere between 12 and 13 seconds to finish the opening measures. So it's possible then that all 4 groups will arrive within the same second at the tutti measure, measure 6, united under one conductor, the principal conductor, to continue then at figure 1. However, it is equally, or just as equally possible, that due to the freedom in timing with which groups 2, so notice the freely, and 4, both have been granted or burdened, depending on your perspective, they may either finish ahead of the other groups or stretch out the introduction or anything in between. The second example here starts in the second measure of figure 5. The assistant conductor rises very briefly to conduct the first violins for 4 measures and then the violas for 3 measures. The principal conductor retains control over the rest of the orchestra. Circled in red, the group under the assistant conductor's directions performs a rhythm subdivided into 4 beats per measure. This occurs against a backdrop shown in blue of a measure divided into 3 equal parts, though rhythmically complicated. An example here of composed polymetric situation of 4 against 3. By adding a second conductor, it could be argued that Ives and Sater and Stokowski attempted to make these polymetrics more clearly accessible to the audience. At this point in the piece, a visually attentive audience could now not only audibly appreciate the multiple metrics and the rhythms aligned with each tempo, they also have it visually framed for them by two conductors. Also, based on my own orchestral experience, it's probably a lot easier to perform this with two or more conductors. At figure 8, our third example, Ives splits the orchestra into two groups, an upper orchestra, which resembles a kind of wind band, and a lower orchestra that looks like a string ensemble. Besides this instrumentation, the two groups also differ from each other in three parameters: dynamics, tempo, and rhythm. As far as tempo, the second, is concerned, as shown above, even without the indicated acceleration, the upper orchestra would arrive at the fermata in the measure before figure 9, the tutti, roughly 15 seconds earlier than the lower orchestra, and then add on top of that the accelerando. Ives writes a lengthy footnote as a means of an introduction and perhaps to explain this section. In it, he puts forth his attempt to foist artistic decisions on the audience, relying on their perspective as a substantial interpretation of the piece. And I quote, "As the eye, in looking at a view, may focus on the sky, clouds, or distant outlines, yet sense the color and form of the foreground, and then, by bringing the eye to the foreground, sense the distant outlines and color. So, in some similar way, can the listener choose to arrange in his mind the relation of the rhythmic, harmonic, and other material." In closing, it may be suggested that in any music based to some extent on more than one or two rhythmic, melodic, harmonic schemes, the hearer has a rather active part to play. Ives also takes the time to describe a concert he heard as a child, in which the members of the band arranged themselves around the town square. He writes about and is obviously inspired by the various reactions of the townspeople, one of which never left his home and insisted that the group playing closest to his house presented the true music. Others were fascinated by how the music changed as they walked around the square. It's therefore conceivable that at a polyconductoral moment, like figure 8, the audience also has an active conductoral role to play. Ives challenges the audience to make an active and conscious artistic choice, forcing them to unify individual musicians into a harmoniously cooperative whole for themselves. The fourth section of Poly-Conductoral Procedure I would like to demonstrate for you in 3 videos. All 3 videos have exactly the same audio track, which I took from the third demonstration video that I'm going to show you. The material, if you're following along at home with the score, covers the beginning of the 4th measure of figure 11 and ends in the 4th measure of figure 12. In this first example, I've attempted to show essentially what a blind concertgoer would perceive. The conductor is not moving, and so the listener must focus their attention on all the sounds of the orchestra without any guidance from the conductors. In this example, I've played the part of both conductors. And finally, this video is the original. Based on the reactions I had from showing these 3 videos to my fellow researchers in Antwerp, it is arguable that a visually attentive audience, given that they can see the conductor's patterns, would perceive at least 3 separate groups. 2 of the groups very clearly play on the downbeats of their respective conductor, and are thus linked aurally and visually. A third, a breakaway of group 1, while playing in the same temporal structure of the principal conductor, avoid their conductor's downbeats altogether, and are therefore visually and aurally decoupled temporarily from the conductor. Here's that last video again. Figure 23 is a sudden, unique, and intimate section for the solo piano, accompanied by the strings, percussion, and 2 ostinato groups. The 3 groups are shown here respectively in red, blue, and green. In this polyconductoral section, Ives has created an aleatoric accompaniment to a small and composed cadenza for the solo piano. The solo pianist takes the artistic lead in group 1, and the principal conductor is tasked with making sure that the other members of this group play together with the pianist. Group 2 is clearly led by the assistant conductor, who has significant freedom in tempo. The tempo indications are at first allegro, so a range, and then later in the middle of the 5th measure before figure 25, adjusted by the indication a little faster. The solo viola of group 3 also shares the same amount of freedom that group 2 enjoys. However, the solo pianist will determine the general duration of this section. Its cadenza concludes in the 2nd measure of figure 25, whereupon the principal conductor retakes the lead and signals the start of a tutti section that progresses under their baton. The last section that is led by more than one conductor starts in the 3rd measure of figure 31 and continues until figure 35. Some musicians must switch teams and dedicate their loyalty temporarily to the other conductor, which represents a rather unique part of this symphony. The role of lead conductor also appears to switch for 3 measures of figure 33 from the principal conductor to the assistant conductor. All right, so I've now demonstrated that according to the standard I applied and within current performance practice, 6 sections of polyconductoral procedure are employed in the 2nd movement of Ives' 4th Symphony. But why? What possible motivations could Ives, Seeger, and/or Stokowski have had to approach the work in this manner? First, multiple conductoral actors appear to be utilized in this piece for their artistic and substantive inputs. The principal conductor seems obvious, especially within this context. The assistant conductor is less obvious. However, I think I've demonstrated above that in at least 4 of the 6 polyconductoral sections, the assistant conductor is burdened with making artistic choices for at least the musicians under their direction. And finally, the soloists, who have also been tasked at times with taking the reins of at least a small portion of the orchestra in at least sections 1 and 5. Secondly, there are 2 detectable economic motivations for using polyconductoral procedures. First, tradition. The piece has been composed for a large symphony orchestra, soloists, and a chorus, and within the Western art music symphonic tradition. That tradition dictates that a conductor direct such a work live. Secondly, the piece would simply be too difficult to perform without a 1st and 2nd conductor, and sometimes a 3rd. Like I talked about at the top, Cedar, the publisher, convinced Stokowski to perform and rehearse the piece with multiple conductors for this very reason. The presence of the assistant conductor or conductors makes the piece performable within a reasonable amount of rehearsal time and treasure. Third, at certain moments when artistic choice burdens both conductors and soloists, it is conceivable that none can be held solely responsible for the final result presented to a listening and watching audience. 3 instances can be found in the 1st, 3rd, and 5th sections of polyconductoral procedure. At such times, artistic choice is asked of and even foisted upon the audience. Furthermore, Ives was clearly motivated to allow the audience's perception of the piece to play a key role in their interpretation of it. And finally, along those same lines, there's evidence that specific gestures and signals have been deployed that belong to and are part of the generally recognizable movement repertoire of an orchestral and ensemble conductor. In the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 6th sections of polyconductoral procedure, each conductor shows a different and yet recognizable meter and tempo simultaneously to the other. This creates visual polymetric situations. Even to a deaf concertgoer, the polymetric score could be perceivable. It is arguable then that the presence of 2 or more silent conductors is not a byproduct or phenomenon of the difficult score, but is rather an intended and necessary aspect of the piece and the performance thereof. Ives, Stokowski, and Cedar have offered a framework for the visually attentive audience to appreciate the piece. 2 or more conductors simultaneously beating different patterns, each linked to specific sounds, tempos, and instruments. Thank you very much for listening and especially watching my presentation. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions or respond to any comments any of you might have.